Welcome to Schweitzer Drive, a podcast where we explore what goes on between the generation of electricity and the light switch. Join Dave Whitehead as he interviews the entrepreneurs, innovators, and experts who are inventing the future of electric power.
Hi, I'm Dave Whitehead, the host of Schweitzer Drive, and today we are going to discuss the recent electrical challenges in Texas. As part of the electric sector, I'm always interested to learn why the lights go out in particular places, and certainly that's happened in Texas, and our sympathies go out to all of those impacted by the power outages. I think it'd be helpful before we start our discussion to break down what happened and talk about what we can do going forward. And fortunately, today I'm joined with Dr. Ed Schweitzer and David Costello. Dr. Ed Schweitzer is the founder, president, and chief technology officer at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories. Ed is a pioneer in power system protection and is one of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to electric power systems, business, and really any number of other topics. And my second guest is David Costello. I've worked with David for over 25 years. David is our chief sales and service officer. David is based in Texas, lived through the power outages, and he brings a lot of insight to this topic. I'm going to set the stage just a little bit, just going back to, let's say, February 12th, when the weather started getting cold. In fact, I got a text from David saying, hey, I'm going to have to stay home today. I got to do some winterization in my house, and Dave is just outside of San Antonio. And the next day, got some freezing rain. The day after that, it started snowing. And by February 18th, the temp got down to 40 degrees below normal temperatures. Wind turbines weren't producing power. Gas plants weren't producing power. Thermal plants weren't producing power. The nuclear plants, one of them went offline, and you ended up with over 4 million people without power. So, Dave, what's going on in Texas?
Well, I was one of those people. Well, first of all, thank you, and thank Ed for having me. It's always fun. I was one of those customers, of course, that was without power at my home. We lost power at our SEL office nearby my home, of course, and so I experienced this low-watt life for the better part of a week. It did get cold, you're right. The temperature at my house got down to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. We had freezing rain and snow the weekend of Valentine's Day, and another round of snow later in the week. And we're used to some freezing temperatures, but getting down into the single digits and then staying there below freezing for over a week, that's the part that's really unusual for us, but not unprecedented. We've had cold weather before. In fact, we've had some cold weather that led to rolling blackouts before, but you mentioned
David,
February. Yes, sir.
I had a few minutes here before we got started, and I looked up Waco and Dallas just for fun. And the coldest temperature on record for Waco was in January 1949, where it got down to -5. But in 1989, it got down to -4 out there. In 1930, -1, and 49. 1 in December 1929, 2 degrees. Dallas Fort Worth in 1899 was -8, and 1949 -2, and that compares with February 2021 when it got down to -2. That's a tie. December 89 -1, January 1930 was -1. So you're right, these cold temperatures do happen, and associated sometimes with snow and ice storms and other inclement conditions. So I'm with you that I don't think this was all that unusual of a winter situation. So I'm real interested to hear some more about what made this one so very special.
Well, I've heard people say unprecedented and once in a lifetime, and I'm with you, Ed. That I don't believe that's true. We don't like cold weather as much as our friends up north, but we do get it from time to time. Some people don't realize if you don't live here, the temperature in the summertime is so hot. We ventilate attics. We can put a lot of insulation in attics, but we have a lot of air circulation from soffit vents to continuous ridge vents on roofs. Some people even have fans to move air through their attic. All of that's to be more efficient during the summertime. Of course, that means your attic can get really, really, really cold in these kind of winter conditions. And some home builders run water lines and put hot water heaters up in that attic space instead of taking up floor space on the floor plan. So, of course, Dave, you mentioned we knew some cold was coming. So here in Texas, you start wrapping faucets, you drip faucets, and you do all the things that you can possibly do around your home to prepare, stock up on some food, and fill the car up with gas. The governor of Texas knew that there was a pretty bad situation coming because he declared a disaster emergency pretty early on. By Sunday, February 14th, we had exceeded any kind of forecasted demand. The forecasted demand, interestingly enough, just a few months ago, we thought we'd get up into the high 50 gigawatts. And then closer, we thought we might reach 67 gigawatts. And we actually set a new winter peak at 69 gigawatts of demand. So a lot of demand for electric power, coupled with a lot of demand for natural gas for heating and running power plants, of course, to supply that electric power. And somewhere the evening of the 14th, when we hit that peak, the system also started running into dire straits. We had entered a point where, from an operational standpoint, we were over the course of about 20 minutes, the system frequency dropped from 60 to about 59.3 was the low point. We had to
David, that's bad, right? Just for our listeners,
yeah.
Just to make sure.
A frequency drop of 0.7 hertz is epic. That looks like when you look at that on a frequency chart, that looks like a cliff. And
that's a good reason that your state is connected asynchronously to the eastern and western regions and Mexico, so that at least you didn't goof up our frequency so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So as the frequency was dipping, obviously the demand is greater than the generation, so the operator has precious little alternative but to start dropping significant chunks of load, which means turning off people's lights. And we, over that course of about 20 or 30 minutes, dropped something like 10,500 megawatts, almost 11 gigawatts of load in the state of Texas to save the state from going into a system-wide blackout. So there'll be a lot of finger pointing and complaining, but the operators probably got their lifetime supply of adrenaline that evening, keeping the system together. And that's all the operational side. The generation supplies were under duress. Many wind turbines were iced up. Solar panels had snow on them, of course. A lot of conventional steam or thermal plants had problems too. Natural gas supply issues, freezing instrumentation, water and cooling systems having freezing problems, and a tremendous amount of generation came offline. Just in that 20-minute period in the beginning, some 6 or 7 gigawatts of generation tripped offline.
Well, David, I'm glad you made that point, that this is not about coal versus wind or gas versus solar. No, this is about making sure that electric power is reliable under the worst of conditions, because we're so dependent on it. You look at the furnace in your home, and most of us use gas forced air, and you can have all the gas you want, but if you don't have electricity today to run the controls of that furnace, you don't have heat. So the furnace is an AND gate between the gas and electricity. And we got this growing interdependence that with all the electricity that comes from natural gas in Texas these days, that when you when we the people plug more stuff in and turn more stuff on, the gas turbines have to work harder, so they're going to be they draw more gas from the pipelines, the pressures go down, and you at the same time that everybody's thermostats are clicking on to, and it's all become so dependent, or much more dependent on natural gas. And NERC had been predicting this for years in their studies, hadn't they? Since what, 2000?
You're right.
2011.
Yes, 2011. We had another infamous polar vortex event, and there's a lessons learned. I suppose we could edit it now. Lessons learned, but perhaps not completely implemented. Web page where we learned a lot from that incident, including the need to make sure natural gas compressor stations have electricity, and the natural gas wellheads don't get outaged, and that we winterize both the natural gas supply system as well as power plants. And a lot of that wasn't done. That's well documented, and it was 10 years ago, and much of that wasn't done, of course. And then, Dave, getting back to your question, just to summarize, we lived under these conditions for the bulk of a week. Many people had rotating blackouts. My 90-year-old parents had power on, power off for an hour at a time. At my house, we went without Monday the 15th for 9 hours in single digit and low teens temperatures. It got pretty cold that day. Of course, productivity kind of came to a halt because businesses were asked to shut down, like semiconductor plants, refineries, oil and gas production, grocery stores. Everybody was turned off and conserving, but then mandatory doing without as well. A lot of people suffered broken water mains. A friend of mine who has a pharmacy that was catastrophically damaged when a water main burst because of freezing. So it was a rough week.
Yeah, and this on top of the pandemic and the shot clinics that were canceled because of no power, and just there's a lot of suffering. I was talking to an associate at MD Anderson in Houston, and well, they had power over there at the cancer hospitals, but he said at home it was about 52 in their house, and they were trying to heat it with a fireplace. And I'll bet it wasn't one designed by Ben Franklin.
So that kind of describes the week in the middle of February. But Ed, you're the oldest one of the three of us. How do you
probably put together?
I don't think it's quite that. Maybe close. But how do you think we got here? This just probably didn't happen overnight. On one day you got electricity and the next day you don't.
Well, just to follow up on Dave's age thing, I'm 73 years old and still loving every day of what the opportunities we have to serve our industry. And when I was a kid, the electric power companies are generally known as public service companies, and the concept of service was personified with Ready Kilowatt, the guy with the lightning bolt arms and legs and a light bulb for his nose. And that's what it was about. It was about, when you need me, I'm there. I'll be ready. I'm Ready Kilowatt. And the public service company is by definition in business to serve the public. And Samuel Insull and Tom Edison, Insull recommended the concept of regional franchised monopolies because capital always gets its pay. And the concept was that in a certain region, a utility would provide the generation, the transmission, and the distribution to its customers, pretty much all in balance, designed together to take care of a region, such as part of Illinois and another utility for part of Wisconsin, another one for northern Indiana, and so forth. And every one of these would plan their business to make sure they had enough generation for their customers. And they began to interconnect one another and have intertie agreements to manage these interconnections for the mutual benefit of these neighboring regional franchises. So today we start to think about all those interconnections aggregated into a grid, which frankly still doesn't really exist. And instead we have this set of interconnections that were there to ensure that if one utility needed to take a unit out of service, that it could count on its neighbors supplying the power during that maintenance cycle and so forth. And this was all worked out together so that your utility and my utility, his and hers, would all plan region by region to make sure everything was in good, pretty much in good balance. So that's where we were, and the smartest guys in the room, those Enron guys, pushed for deregulation. And who wouldn't be for deregulation? That sounds good, free markets and so forth. But you go back to the Edison and Insull days. Samuel Insull liked to refer to the utility industry because of its capital intensity and because of its need to provide absolutely reliable service, was a natural monopoly. He talked about, well, there's pictures you can see of before the phone companies had their regional and natural monopolies, how there were so many telephone lines from different companies. I remember seeing a picture of a Sears and Roebuck executive with something like half a dozen telephones on his desk, one connected to, one associated with each of the different phone companies he had to work with. So we moved away from this to merchant generators, which is something Enron and some others really wanted. And over the course of a couple of presidents, administrations, including a DNR, to stress the apolitical nature of all of this, is that over time the FERC 888 appeared, and which allowed for these merchant generators, if you will, to be operating in a relatively open and free market, free from many regulations, and maybe without the responsibility they needed according to some plan. So where did the planning start to happen? It started in these organizations like ERCOT that then had to somehow plan the management of assets they didn't even have all that much control over. So I think the situation is unmanageable, and that the way it is presently designed. And some people say, Ed, we'll never get that toothpaste back in the tube. But kind of jumping ahead to what I'd like to see is in what is held fast in some areas is where the generation and the transmission and distribution are still all planned together for a particular region. I think we're going to be a lot better off. So,
what it really sounds though is the challenges we certainly had in Texas. There were no technical challenges, right? This was not a technology problem.
No.
Turbines, work in cold climates. They know how to keep the blades spinning. Thermal plants know how to work in cold regions. So this is not a green energy, brown energy.
You're right, Dave. You think about the jet engines on an airplane. They fly around in temperatures where it's minus 60, and that's pretty cold. And the nacelles on those engines have heaters in them, with bleed air heaters. The propellers on turboprop and piston airplanes often have boots on their leading edges to break the ice off, so this icing stuff at low temperatures, these are things that people know how to handle for gas turbines, for all sorts of generators. But you gotta wanna. And I think in the old days that maybe there was a lot more attention paid to keeping the lights on. Going back to Edison and Insull like to say that electric power must be so reliable that we will trust it for the transportation in our cities, such as to power the trains, and also trust it for the vertical transportation within our skyscrapers, meaning the elevators. And that was stressed from the very, very beginning in our electric power industry. What a legacy it is that we've all inherited, who have the privilege of serving this industry today. And prioritizing reliability is of utmost importance.
So if it particularly in Texas, this wasn't a technology problem for the lights going out. So then if we move on, is it a regulatory or a market design problem then? Because Ed, you used the word, monopoly or region monopoly, and I think everybody goes, oh, that sounds icky, or there's something wrong with it. We have a free trade or free enterprise. That always sounds really, really good. So somehow things got crossed for keeping the lights on, right? I would think, man, Texas must have the best market. People can put power into the system if they want to and get paid for it, and that'll drive prices down. What could possibly go wrong with it? And obviously something
just ask
did.
David.
Well, a couple of thoughts. I think sometimes I think as an industry where we've been so successful and been so reliable, the average citizen in the United States largely takes for granted the fact that the lights will turn on at a reasonable rate and safely and reliably every time they flip that switch. But weeks like Valentine's week here in Texas do teach a unforgettable lesson and remind us that absolutely nothing works without electric power. I mean, nothing. You mentioned, you can't heat the house. You can't put pressure in the water system. My daughter was under a boil water ban or a notice in Austin and then lost water entirely. We had a friend who was using buckets of water from the pool in the backyard. Luckily, he had a swimming pool, a big storage tank of water in the backyard to get water to flush the toilets in the house for 5 days or more. It was just, you just realize that everything comes to a screeching halt without power. And one other thought on the technology or the fuel source or the type of generation. I think a lesson you learn in an event like this is diversity is good. All your eggs in a renewable basket of wind wouldn't have helped us this week, because this season in Texas typically is not a strong wind producing season. We don't count on the wind turbines, or we can't count on them to supply wind. So we can't put all of our eggs in that basket. On the other hand, if we put all of our eggs in a natural gas basket without winterizing power plants and the supply chain, we get into trouble there. I think diversity is good in generation and the demand side. But I think there's a fair argument for a need for swift and dramatic change to the way the market is set up here in Texas, the way it's regulated and operated. I think these extremes where we say regulated monopolies were bad and deregulation is great. Well, Enron, you mentioned Enron earlier, Ed. Enron famously got in trouble for falsifying generation capacity in order to manipulate a free market in California about 20 years ago. So, completely.
When that happened, David, and there started to be electric power problems in California, I was afraid they may propagate to the Northwest. So that's when SEL started buying backup diesel gen sets. And boy, am I glad we have those these days. And that's another thing, is that if we don't get this right as an industry, that to actually supply the power, the flick of a switch, at the speed of light when the customers need it. If we don't, then customers are going to take these matters into their own hands, and they should, to save their families and their livelihoods. Meaning, well, you'll see more and more diesel sets and diesel storage tanks going in, and other kinds of local generators, which is at a cost of, it's not an efficient use of capital, and it's not the cleanest, most efficient way to burn fuel either. And I do think that when it comes to the diversity of sources, that Texas right now doesn't have too much solar generation, and more of that will help. But that won't do a lot of good if you don't have lots of transmission capacity to be able to, to make the intermittent solar power a little bit more mittent when it comes to where it's snowing and where the clouds are over and so forth. So there's a lot to do, but I keep going back to the regional franchise, these smaller entities that would plan the generation, the transmission, and the distribution all together. And I think that's at the key of the success going forward.
I agree with you. Our names were things like the company I worked for was Central Power and Light. And even in the name of the company, as you mentioned earlier, growing up and talking to your dad, Ed, it was crystal clear what our responsibility was. Sorry to interrupt, Dave.
Absolutely. Yeah, my dad always called it the PS company. Everybody knew what the PS company was, the public service company.
Well, I bet they did in David's region a few weeks ago. And I guess I shouldn't laugh. That was horrific, that what happened down there. So Ed, you made a comment that maybe, or David, you couldn't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube. And my question is, Ed, you said that maybe going back to the G, the T, and the D model, the vertically integrated utility, there's a lot of benefit to the consumer, the customer, for that kind of model. Do you think we could ever get back there? At the end of the day, I can appreciate people want to have independent power producers, and what a great business model this may make. But at the end of the day, I really don't want to think about my electricity. That our local provider's done such a great job. I really don't have to, and I got to believe I'm like millions of Americans, that I just want cheap, affordable, reliable electricity. And so, what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think we can get back to a point like that, or it's just no?
I think we can.
I do too. And one of the reasons why I'm so confident in that is if you look at the state of Texas and ERCOT in specifically within the state of Texas, we're an eclectic mix of models. Not everybody is a participant in wholesale competition. Not everyone is a participant in the retail competition. I'm a customer of an electric cooperative. Our office here is a customer of a vertically integrated municipality, a municipally owned electric utility. So there's all kinds of different models, even within this perceived deregulated ERCOT. I don't, and a deregulated market was just that's a policy, a legislative, and a market decision. So if we did all that 20 years ago, we can certainly construct a different policy, enact different legislation, and mandate a new type of market tomorrow if we so choose.
So if Central Light and Power still were a going concern, if Central Light and Power wanted to arrange with Ed's deregulated generator for energy, that would be Central Light and Power's decision to do it or to not, depending on what kind of a business deal that they and Ed came up with. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I think, too, that we have a lot of assets, generating assets that probably were pretty much isolated and underused in this thing. Sometimes I wonder just how many megawatts of backup diesel plants there are that were these integrated into the electric power system, that they could help out the supply and even the stability of the power systems. So when you talk about diversity, it's like putting all these assets together and making them all weigh in. And we're going through this tremendously important phase of integrating renewables everywhere. So rooftop solar and even neighborhood battery sorts of things, and many things like that. And there's no reason why we can't even do more with the integration of some of these backup plants that are everywhere. And of course, they're there to for the grocery stores, the hospitals, and the fire departments, and businesses that find them essential. But they're almost always way over capacity in their design. And years ago, we did a project in I think it was over in the Portland area, where we helped the utility tie together some assets at a hospital and some other places, so that they could actually dispatch those units under certain conditions. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing, and when the system is so complicated as it is today, it was so complicated that we needed to invent in Texas an ERCOT to take care of it all. And if we can, as we begin to simplify things again, then the smart people at the Houston Power and Light and the Central Power and Light and the Texas utilities and other places, these smart folks will figure out how to best keep the lights on and prioritize reliability, at the same time of getting every possible benefit out of the renewable resources for a cleaner environment.
If I translated that, I think I guess the way I like to think about it is, if we just free people up to think of using and gates instead of or gates, instead of green or deregulated markets, or if we think about things like cleaner environment and affordable power, reliable power, safe power, abundant power, and then free up our own creativity and the use of technology to let engineers solve these problems, we'll get there.
We will. And the electric power system really is a miracle. If you think about it, that we can get, for an average price in the United States at the retail residential level, I think is about 13 cents a kilowatt hour today. And it's there at the flick of a switch and the speed of light. And it's even after a century, it's a modern marvel. And it's our legacy. And there's so many smart people in this industry today who really understand and empathize with the pain of mid-February in Texas, that things will improve.
Well, Ed, I was going to try to wrap it up with some profound summary or something like that, but I think you just did it. And I think with that, I'd like to thank both of you for this discussion. I bet we get on this podcast again and talk about where Texas is at, where our country's at after the events in Texas. And David, I hope you're getting warmer down there. And to both of you, I look forward to talking to you on a future podcast. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. All right. Until next time, see you, gentlemen.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for stopping by Schweitzer Drive. Join us again as we learn about, explore, and celebrate electric power. For more information about the show, please visit selinc.com/Schweitzer Drive.